The year is 793. Somewhere off the northeastern coast of England, a fleet of narrow, serpent-headed ships cuts through water the color of iron. The men aboard do not speak. They do not need to. They have crossed open sea in vessels most people of this era would never dare board, guided by stars, by wind patterns memorized across generations, by something deeper than knowledge. Instinct bred into them by centuries of living at the edge of the world. Their hands are calloused from rowing, their cloaks are soaked through, and yet there is no hesitation in their eyes, only purpose. On the shore ahead, the monastery of Lindisfarne rises against a pale morning sky. The monks inside have no warning. The sea, which was supposed to be a wall of protection, has become a highway, and the men coming through it are not raiders by accident. They are the product of something ancient, something shaped by ice and stone and hunger, and the particular genius of people who learned to survive in a land that never promised them anything. This is where history remembers the Viking Age beginning. One raid, one morning. One island monastery, torn apart by men who seemed to emerge from nowhere. But that is not the true story. That morning on Lindisfarne was not a beginning. It was a consequence. The true origin of the Vikings does not begin with violence. It begins thousands of years earlier, in a land of glaciers and darkness, where human beings first learned what it meant to endure. If you want to understand who the Vikings really were, you have to go back to the land itself, because no people in history were shaped more completely by their environment than the Norse. And before we can tell their story, we have to feel. The world that made them Scandinavia is not a gentle place. It never was. The peninsula that stretches from the southern plains of Denmark northward into Norway and Sweden is a land of extremes. Towering mountain ranges that trap settlements in narrow valleys, deep-carved fjords where the sea reaches inland like fingers searching for something to grip. Dense forests of pine and birch that swallow the light, and winters that last so long they feel less like a season and more like a punishment. In the far north, the sun disappears entirely for weeks at a time. The cold there is not simply uncomfortable, it is a presence, a force with intention. And in the earliest centuries of human settlement across this landscape, surviving it required everything a community had to give. The first people to inhabit these lands arrived following the retreating glaciers of the last ice age, sometime around 10,000 years before the Common Era. As the ice pulled back northward, it left behind a landscape both ravaged and raw, scraped valleys, exposed bedrock, rivers wild with meltwater, and coastlines still adjusting to the weight lifted from them. These earliest inhabitants were hunter-gatherers, following the herds of reindeer and elk that moved through the newly opened landscape, fishing the rivers and coastal waters that were already extraordinary in their abundance. They did not build empires. They did not leave written records. But they left something else, a relationship with this land, with its rhythms and demands that would echo forward through millennia into the culture we eventually call Norse. Over thousands of years, waves of migration and cultural exchange transformed Scandinavian society. By around 2000 BCE, agricultural communities had taken root across southern Scandinavia, particularly in what is now Denmark and the southern regions of Sweden. These Bronze Age peoples built elaborate burial mounds, crafted weapons and ceremonial objects of surprising beauty, and developed trade networks that reached as far as the Mediterranean. They were not isolated. They were not primitive. The image of ancient northern Europeans as somehow cut off from the currents of civilization is a misunderstanding that history has worked hard to correct. The people of Bronze Age Scandinavia traded amber, found abundantly along Baltic shores, across enormous distances, receiving bronze, gold, and cultural ideas in return. Amber was in many ways the oil of the ancient world, and the people of the north controlled its primary source, but Scandinavia was also a land that demanded constant negotiation. The growing seasons were short, the soil in many regions poor and rocky, the winters unforgiving. A bad harvest was not merely an inconvenience, it was a potential death sentence. And this fundamental reality of northern life created something in the people who endured it. A particular hardness, certainly, but also a particular creativity. When the environment will not provide what you need, you learn to go somewhere else to find it. When the land cannot sustain your growing population, you learn to move. And when you are surrounded on three sides by water, movement almost inevitably means taking to the sea. The sea. It is impossible to overstate how completely the sea shaped the Norse world. Norway alone has a coastline so fragmented by fjords and islands that, if straightened out, it would stretch approximately 25,000 kilometers. Sweden and Denmark added thousands more kilometers of accessible coastline and navigable waterways. For the peoples of this region, the sea was not a boundary. It was a road. In fact, for much of Scandinavia's history, the sea was the only road that made reliable sense. The mountain ranges and dense forests that divided the interior made overland travel slow, dangerous, and often impossible. But the water connected everything. A skilled sailor could move goods, people, and ideas faster by sea than any road through those forests could ever allow. And so the Norse became sailors. Not overnight, and not by choice exactly, but because their world demanded it, and because they were, generation by generation, extraordinarily good at answering demands. By the time we reach the Iron Age in Scandinavia, roughly 500 BCE onward, something remarkable is already underway. The people of these northern lands are developing a maritime culture without parallel in the ancient world. They are building boats, not just simple fishing vessels or rivercraft, but sophisticated open-water ships capable of crossing the North Sea and the Baltic in conditions that would terrify most peoples of the ancient Mediterranean. Early Scandinavian boat-building techniques show a continuous evolution across centuries, each generation refining the craft, learning from failure, pushing towards something better. The famous clinker-built construction method, in which planks of wood are overlapped and riveted together to create a hull both light and flexible, was being developed in Scandinavia during this period. It was a method of genius. A clinker-built hull does not fight the sea. It moves with it, flexing under the stress of waves rather than cracking against them. It was a design that would one day carry Norse warriors to the coasts of England, Ireland, France, Iceland, Greenland, and the shores of North America. But long before all of that, it was simply the solution that a northern people developed to survive in a world defined by water. Now, if you are finding this history as fascinating as we do, this is a great moment to subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell. We are only just beginning to uncover how one of history's most extraordinary civilizations came to be, and the story is going to go places you may not expect. Stay with us. The Germanic peoples of ancient Europe are something of a puzzle to modern historians, but their place in the Norse story is essential. By the 1st century of the Common Era, Roman writers like Tacitus were describing the Germanic tribes of northern Europe in considerable detail, and what they described, even filtered through Roman bias and incomplete understanding, reveals a world of sophisticated social structures, fierce independence, and a warrior culture already deeply embedded in Northern European identity. The Germanic peoples were not a single unified group. They were a vast collection of tribes, clans, and peoples spread across an enormous territory from the Rhine to the Vistula, from the Danube to the shores of the North and Baltic Seas. The ancestors of the Norse belonged to the northern branch of this Germanic world, the peoples who would eventually become what we call the Scandinavians. What bound these northern Germanic peoples together, even across the enormous diversity of their individual tribes and clans, was language, religion, and a set of shared cultural values that were already, by the early centuries of the Common Era, recognizably Norse in character. The Old Norse language, which developed from Proto-Germanic across several centuries, was a tongue shaped by the landscape that produced it, full of precise words for specific kinds of weather, specific qualities of water, specific types of terrain. A language that had, as linguists have noted, multiple distinct words for different kinds of snow, different qualities of sea conditions, different states of winter darkness. Language reveals thought, and the thought of the early Norse was the thought of people for whom the natural world was not background, it was the entire foreground of existence. Their religion reflected this as well. The Norse pantheon, the gods and goddesses who would eventually be recorded in texts like the Prose Edda and the Poetic Edda, composed centuries later but drawing on traditions reaching back into deep prehistory, was not a religion of comfort. It was a religion of honesty. The Norse gods were not perfect, omnipotent beings who controlled the universe from a position of absolute security. They were powerful, yes, but also flawed, also mortal in their own way. The great god Odin, the All-Father, says, hanging himself from the world tree Yggdrasil for 9 days and nights to gain knowledge of the runes. He was a god of sacrifice, of the price that must be paid for understanding. Thor, his son, was immensely powerful and also deeply human in his anger and his vulnerabilities. Even the end of the world, Ragnarok, was built into Norse cosmology not as something to be prevented, but as something to be met with courage. The gods themselves would die at Ragnarok, fighting to the last. And this was considered not tragedy but dignity. This is a religion shaped by a world that offers no guarantees. In Scandinavia, the harvest could fail. The storm could sink the ship. The rival clan could burn the longhouse. The cosmos offered the same terms as the climate: fierce beauty, genuine abundance in the good seasons, and absolutely no promises about tomorrow. The Norse did not worship gods who made the world safe. They worshipped gods who showed them how to face a world that wasn't. And this cosmology had direct, practical consequences on Norse culture and behavior. The concept that historians have translated somewhat imperfectly as fate, the Norse idea that certain things were simply written, destined, unavoidable, did not produce passivity. It produced something closer to recklessness in the eyes of outsiders, and something closer to freedom in the eyes of the Norse themselves. If you cannot avoid your fate, then fear of fate becomes irrational. What matters is not whether you survive, but how you conduct yourself in the living. The Norse warrior who faced death without flinching was not demonstrating suicidal bravado. He was demonstrating philosophical consistency with a worldview he had held since childhood. Death comes for everyone. The only question is what you do before it arrives. This is the culture that was developing in Scandinavia in the centuries before what we call the Viking Age. Not a culture of savagery, not a culture of mindless violence, but a culture profoundly shaped by its environment, its theology, and its long practical experience with the demands of the northern world. Now let us talk about the social structure of early Norse society, because it is here that we find some of the most important seeds of what eventually became the Viking explosion. Norse society in the centuries preceding the Viking Age was organized primarily around the family unit and the clan, what the Norse called the kin group. These were not primitive arrangements. They were sophisticated systems of mutual obligation, protection, and resource sharing that made survival possible in a challenging environment. Every member of a kin group had responsibilities to the others, and every member could expect protection and support in return. Honor, a concept absolutely central to Norse culture, was not merely personal. It was communal. An insult to one member of a family was an insult to all. An injury to one demanded a response from all. This system of collective honor and collective obligation generated enormous social cohesion. It also generated enormous conflict. The Norse blood feud, the cycle of reprisal and counter-reprisal that could pursue families across generations, was a direct product of this honor system taken to its extreme. Sagas written down centuries later, but drawing on authentic traditions of Norse storytelling, are full of feuds that began with a single act of dishonor and wound through decades of retributive violence. This was not unique to the Norse. Similar patterns existed across many pre-state societies. But in the Norse world, it took on a particular intensity because of what was at stake. Resources in Scandinavia were genuinely limited. Land, particularly good agricultural land, was precious. Fishing rights, grazing rights, the control of trade routes, these were not abstract prizes. They were the difference between a community that survived the winter and one that did not. The Norse chieftain, the Jarl, occupied the apex of local social structure, but his authority was never absolute in the way that kings in more hierarchical societies could claim. A Norse Jarl held power through a combination of inherited status, personal reputation, demonstrated generosity, and the loyalty of his followers. Generosity, in fact, was one of the most politically important qualities a Norse leader could possess. The Great Mead Hall, that iconic image of Norse culture, a long timber building filled with firelight and the smell of roasting meat and the sound of skalds singing the deeds of heroes, was not simply a place of feasting. It was a political institution. The Jarl who feasted his followers, who rewarded loyalty with gifts, who demonstrated through his open-handed generosity that those who served him would be materially rewarded. That Jarl built a following. And a following was power. Below the Jarls in social structure were the Carls, the free farmers, fishermen, craftsmen, and traders who formed the backbone of Norse society. These were not serfs or peasants in the feudal sense. Norse free farmers had genuine legal standing, could speak at the thing, the assembly that served as a community's governing body and legal forum, and could, with sufficient ambition and ability, rise considerably in status. Below the Carls were the thralls, enslaved people who occupied the lowest rung of Norse society, performing the hardest labor and possessing no legal rights. Slavery was embedded in Norse society long before the Viking Age properly began, and it would become one of the major economic engines of Viking raiding and trading. A grim fact that must be acknowledged honestly in any complete telling of this history. The Thing, that community assembly, deserves special attention because it represents something genuinely remarkable about early Norse political culture. The Thing was not a body of government in the modern sense, but it performed governing functions that many more hierarchical societies of the period lacked entirely. Free men gathered at regular intervals to resolve legal disputes, make collective decisions about matters affecting the community, and hold even powerful jarls to some degree of accountability. The famous Althing of Iceland, established in 930 CE, is the most well-documented example of this system, but the institution itself was ancient. Versions of community assemblies existed across Scandinavia long before the Viking Age. The Norse were not a democratic people in any modern sense, but they had, embedded in their culture, a genuine tradition of collective deliberation and legal process that coexisted with, and sometimes constrained the power of their warriors and chiefs. Make sure you hit the like button if you are learning things here that surprised you. The Norse world is full of moments that challenge what we think we know, and we have much more to discover together in this video. By the 6th and 7th centuries of the Common Era, Scandinavia was a landscape in motion. Population was growing across the region, pressing against the limits of available agricultural land. Trade networks across the Baltic and the North Sea were increasingly sophisticated, creating both opportunities and competitive pressures. The Great Migration period of European history, that enormous churning of peoples across the continent following the decline of Roman authority in the West, had sent tremors all the way into Scandinavia, disrupting old equilibria and opening new possibilities. And the Norse were watching all of this with the pragmatic attention of people who understood that the world was changing, and that those who moved first, moved farthest, moved with the greatest skill, would determine what the new arrangement looked like. The ships were getting better. This is perhaps the single most important technological development in the story of Norse expansion, and it deserves its own moment in our narrative. The Viking longship, that extraordinary vessel that would become the most recognizable symbol of the Norse world, did not spring into existence fully formed. It was the product of centuries of continuous development, each generation of Norse shipbuilders refining the design inherited from their fathers and pushing it further. By the 7th century, Scandinavian shipbuilding was producing vessels of remarkable capability. The Kvalsund ship, found in Norway and dated to approximately 700 CE, shows a hull design already approaching the sophistication that would characterize the great longships of the Viking Age proper. Long, narrow, shallow of draft, capable of crossing open ocean, and yet also capable of being rowed up shallow rivers, beached directly on a coastline, carried overland between waterways. No other ship of the era combined these qualities. No other ship could do what a Norse longship could do. The shipbuilding traditions of the Norse drew on centuries of accumulated knowledge of wood selection, of the seasonal rhythms that affected timber quality, of the tools and techniques required to shape massive oak planks into the curved forms that made the hull work. This was not casual knowledge. It was craft of the highest order, passed from master to apprentice across generations, treated with the seriousness it deserved because everyone understood that a ship built poorly was a ship that killed the men who sailed it. The sea was not forgiving of poor workmanship. Every joint, every rivet, every carefully selected plank represented a decision that might one day mean the difference between a crew that came home and one that did not. And then there was navigation. The Norse navigated open water without magnetic compasses, without GPS, without the charts and instruments that later European mariners would develop. They navigated by the sun and stars, by the color and temperature of the water, by the presence of certain seabirds that indicated proximity to land, by the behavior of currents and swells that an experienced sailor could read. The way a tracker reads ground, there is evidence that Norse navigators used a device called a sun compass, a wooden disc with a gnomon at the center that could be used to track the sun's arc and maintain a consistent course. There is even evidence, still debated among scholars, that they may have used a mineral called Iceland spar, a form of calcite crystal that polarizes light, to locate the position of the sun even through heavy cloud cover. Whether or not every detail of Norse navigation is fully understood, the practical results are undeniable. Norse sailors crossed the North Atlantic, one of the most dangerous bodies of water on the planet, repeatedly, reliably, and successfully, reaching Iceland, Greenland, and the coast of North America, centuries before any other European maritime tradition came close to attempting it. But in those early centuries, in the period building toward the explosion that we call the Viking Age, the sailing was primarily closer to home. Trade routes across the Baltic connected Scandinavia to the amber markets of Europe, to the fur and slave trades that fed wealthy courts from Francia to Byzantium, to the silver and luxury goods that flowed up from the Islamic world through the river systems of what is now Russia and Ukraine. The Norse were not merely raiders waiting to happen. They were traders, explorers, and merchants of considerable sophistication. Hedeby in southern Jutland, modern Denmark, was becoming one of the most important trading towns in northern Europe during the 8th century. Birka, on an island in Lake Mälaren in Sweden, was another major center of Norse trade, its archaeology revealing contact with cultures from the British Isles to Persia. These were cosmopolitan places, worldly places, places where the Norse encountered the products and ideas of civilizations far beyond their own northern horizon, and encounters with that wider world had consequences. They showed the Norse what existed beyond the sea. They demonstrated the wealth that was available, wealth that could be reached by men with the ships and the skills and the will to cross the water. They revealed the vulnerabilities of distant communities, the monasteries and trading posts and coastal settlements that held tremendous concentrations of portable wealth and were protected by nothing more formidable than their belief that the sea would keep strangers away. The sea, the Norse knew better than anyone alive, kept nothing away. It only separated those with good ships from those with bad ones. The internal pressures of Norse society were building as well. Population growth meant that the eldest son inherited the family farm, while younger sons faced a world with insufficient land to provide for them. The honor culture meant that young men of ambition needed ways to demonstrate worth through combat, through generosity, through the acquisition of wealth and reputation. The political landscape of Scandinavia was increasingly competitive, with powerful chieftains building followings and absorbing or displacing rivals, creating disruptions that sent capable, ambitious men looking for opportunities elsewhere. All of these pressures, demographic, economic, social, political, were converging in the late 8th century, like weather systems building toward a storm. And on a June morning in 793, the storm broke on the shores of Lindisfarne. The raid on Lindisfarne was not a random act of opportunistic violence. It was the visible expression of forces that had been building in Scandinavia for generations. The product of better ships, better navigation, accumulated knowledge of what lay across the water, and a social system that rewarded men who went out and took what the world was not freely offering them. The monks of Lindisfarne, the chroniclers who recorded the event with horror and bewilderment, described it as an act of inexplicable, godless fury, as a punishment visited upon Christendom from outside the known world. They were not wrong to be shocked, but they were wrong to think it came from nowhere. The Norse who landed at Lindisfarne that morning came from a world with its own coherent logic, its own sophisticated understanding of value and strategy, its own centuries-deep tradition of maritime excellence. They were not barbarians in the sense of being cultureless or thoughtless. They were, by the standards of the world they operated in, highly skilled professionals executing a plan based on genuine intelligence about what was available and how to get it. In the years and decades following Lindisfarne, the pattern multiplied. Norse ships appeared on the coasts of Ireland, of Scotland, of Francia. The rivers of Europe, the Seine, the Loire, the Rhine, became highways for Norse penetration into the heart of the continent. Monasteries, trading posts, and coastal towns that had never imagined needing to defend themselves from seaborne attack found themselves suddenly, terrifyingly vulnerable. The Christian world of Western Europe watched these attacks with mounting alarm and a profound theological confusion. If God was just and powerful, why were these pagan northerners allowed to do such things? The question would haunt European Christianity for generations, but at the same time, in the same decades, Norse settlers were moving peacefully into the islands of the North Atlantic. They reached the Faroe Islands, probably in the late 8th century, finding only a handful of Irish monks living in solitary contemplation. They reached Iceland around 874 CE, discovering an uninhabited island of volcanic drama and extraordinary cold, and proceeded to build a functioning society on it from nothing. The same people, the same culture, the same ships, both the raiders who struck Lindisfarne and the settlers who built farms in Iceland. This is the Norse reality in all its complexity. Not simply warriors, not simply farmers, not simply traders, but a people capable of being any of these things, and frequently all of them, depending on what the situation demanded. The Norse expansion was not driven by a single motive or a unified plan. There was no Norse emperor directing operations, no grand strategic vision for Northern European domination. What there was, across hundreds of communities spread throughout Scandinavia, was a shared tradition of maritime skill, a shared cultural framework that valued courage and acquisition and exploration, a shared social pressure that sent ambitious young men toward the horizon in search of what the homeland could not provide. The Viking Age was the aggregate of thousands of individual decisions, each one made by men, and sometimes women, as archaeology has increasingly revealed, who understood their world and were acting rationally within it. Stay with us because in a moment we are going to talk about something that truly changes the picture of who the Norse were. And if you have not subscribed yet, now is a perfect time. The rest of this story goes deeper than most people ever discover. The role of women in early Norse society is one of the most important and most frequently misrepresented aspects of this civilization. The conventional image of the Viking world as an exclusively masculine realm of warriors and chieftains is incomplete in ways that matter enormously for understanding how Norse society actually functioned. Norse women, at least free Norse women, had a degree of legal standing and practical authority that was remarkable compared to most contemporary societies. They could own property, manage estates in the absence of husbands who were away on voyages or campaigns, initiate divorce under certain conditions, and exercise real economic power within the household econom. The Norse household was not a simple hierarchy with a man at the top and everyone else subordinate. It was a complex enterprise in which the woman's authority over the domestic sphere, which included not just cooking and childcare but the supervision of thralls, the management of resources, the production of cloth and other trade goods, was genuine and recognized. The burial record has in recent decades dramatically expanded our understanding of Norse women's roles. The Oseberg ship burial in Norway, excavated in the early 20th century and dated to approximately 834 CE, contained the remains of two women buried with extraordinary wealth and care. Textiles of remarkable quality, a sleigh, horses, cattle, a cart, kitchen equipment, and the ship itself, one of the finest Norse vessels ever found. Whatever we call the women in that grave, they were not peripheral figures in their society. They were people of immense importance, commemorated with resources and ceremony that speak to status and power. And in recent years, DNA analysis and re-examination of burial sites across Scandinavia have revealed what was long suspected, but difficult to prove. Some of the individuals buried with weapons, with the grave goods of warriors and leaders, were women. History is still working through the implications of this. The Norse also had a tradition, reflected in later sagas and in some historical sources, of women who participated directly in the warrior life, the Valkyries of mythology pointing towards something that may have had a real-world counterpart in at least some cases. The degree to which this was as common, exceptional, or mythologized beyond its actual extent remains a subject of scholarly debate. But the debate itself reflects the genuine complexity of Norse gender roles in a way that simpler narratives cannot accommodate. By the early 9th century, the Viking Age was in full motion. Norse settlements were appearing on the islands of the Scottish coast. Dublin, founded as a Norse longfort, a fortified harbor, around 841 CE, would become one of the most important Norse settlements in the West, a trading hub that connected the Norse world of Scandinavia to the Irish world and beyond. The rivers of Russia were being navigated by Norse. By the early 9th century, the Viking Age was in full motion. Norse settlements were appearing on the islands of the Scottish coast. Dublin, founded as a Norse longfort, a fortified harbor, around 841 CE, would become one of the most important Norse settlements in the West, a trading hub that connected the Norse world of Scandinavia to the Irish world and beyond. The rivers of Russia were being navigated by Norse traders, primarily from Sweden, called Varangians by the Slavic peoples they encountered, who were pushing south and east toward the great markets of Byzantium and the Abbasid Caliphate. These Varangian Norse were not raiders in the mode of those who struck the monasteries of England and Ireland. They were traders, entrepreneurs, founders of proto-states that would eventually contribute to the formation of the Kievan Rus, the political entity from which Russia ultimately derives its name. The reach of the Norse in all directions simultaneously was extraordinary. And back in Scandinavia itself, the world was changing. The pressures that had helped launch the initial Norse expansion, population growth, competition for resources, ambitious young men without land, were reshaping political structures at home as well. The small chieftaincies and clan territories of the early Norse world were gradually, violently consolidating into larger political units. Powerful kings were emerging in Norway, Denmark, and Sweden, leaders who combined personal charisma and martial prowess with the political sophistication to build lasting power structures rather than mere temporary followings. Harald Fairhair, whose unification of Norway is traditionally dated to around 872 CE, following the Battle of Hafrsfjord, represents the most dramatic example of this consolidation process in Norwegian history. The significance of Harald's achievement for the broader Norse story is considerable, because the men who lost that battle, the chieftains and jarls whose independence was swallowed by a unified Norwegian kingdom, needed somewhere to go. Many of them went west. Many of them ended up in Iceland, in the Faroe Islands, in the Scottish Islands, carrying their Norse culture and their stubborn independence into the Atlantic beyond the reach of the new king. Political consolidation in Scandinavia fed Norse expansion abroad, just as surely as any economic or demographic pressure. The development of trade networks in the Norse world also deserves fuller recognition than the warrior-centered narrative of Viking history typically allows. The Norse traders who operated across the Baltic, who penetrated the river systems of Eastern Europe, who established the famous Danelaw settlements in England and the Normandy colony in France, these were people engaged in sophisticated economic activity that shaped medieval Europe's commercial landscape. Norse silver hoards found across Scandinavia and representing wealth accumulated through trade rather than raiding are testament to the economic dimension of Norse activity that often gets lost behind the drama of the raids. Furs from the Arctic North, amber from the Baltic coast, walrus ivory from the Greenlandic hunting grounds, slaves taken in raids on Ireland and England and sold in the slave markets of Dublin or Constantinople. The Norse were operating a trading network of intercontinental scope. The goods that flowed back into Scandinavia from this network, Islamic silver dirhams, Byzantine silks, Frankish wine, English metalwork, were transforming Norse society from within. Wealth created hierarchy, and hierarchy created ambition, and ambition created pressure on the political structures of Scandinavian society that drove further consolidation, further expansion, further reaching beyond the horizon for what the North alone could not provide. The Longhouse, that great symbol of Norse domestic life, is perhaps the most honest window we have into what everyday existence looked like for the Norse before and during the Viking Age. Long, rectangular, constructed of timber with walls sometimes of turf, warmed by a central hearth whose smoke rose through an opening in the roof, shared by the family, their livestock, and sometimes their thralls. The Norse longhouse was a world unto itself. In the long winter months when darkness pressed down for 16, 17, 18 hours of every day, and the cold outside was not survivable without shelter, the longhouse was the entire world. Stories were told in that firelight, songs were sung. The skalds, those extraordinary Norse poets whose complex verse forms represented one of the most sophisticated oral literary traditions of the medieval world, performed their compositions for audiences who took poetry with a seriousness difficult for later ages to fully appreciate. The sagas that would eventually be written down in Iceland in the 12th and 13th centuries drew on a storytelling tradition already ancient. The tradition of Norse communities gathering in the winter dark and telling each other who they were, where they came from, what their ancestors had done, what the gods had made of the world, and what it meant to live and die well within it. This oral culture was the vessel in which Norse identity traveled across generations. In the absence of widespread literacy, the skald and the storyteller performed functions that written records perform in other civilizations, preserving history, transmitting values, creating the shared sense of a common past that makes collective identity possible. The precision of Norse skaldic poetry, with its strict metrical rules and its system of kennings, those beautiful compound metaphors in which the sea becomes the whale road, and blood becomes the sword dew, and gold becomes the fire of the Rhine, was not mere artistic ornamentation. It was mnemonic technology, a way of encoding information in forms that could survive centuries of oral transmission without significant distortion. The Norse understood that memory was survival, that identity required story, that the people you were depended absolutely on your ability to tell each other who you had been. And so as we arrive at the eve of the Viking Age proper, we are not looking at a people who emerged from darkness. We are looking at a people who had been preparing for centuries, sharpening their ships and their skills and their understanding of the world beyond their shores, building a culture capable of absorbing the demands of expansion without losing its essential coherence, developing a worldview that made the uncertainty of the sea and the violence of raiding and the loneliness of long voyages into something meaningful rather than merely frightening. The morning at Lindisfarne was not the beginning of the Norse story. It was one scene in a very long drama that had been building since the glaciers retreated and the first human beings walked onto the raw new land of Scandinavia and looked at what the world had given them. They looked at the ice, they looked at the stone, They looked at the dark forests and the cold sea and the winter that seemed to last forever, and they decided to stay. And then, over thousands of years, they decided to do something more than stay. They decided to see what was on the other side. That decision, accumulated across generations, expressed in 1,000 different ways, carried in ships of extraordinary ingenuity, across seas of extraordinary danger, is what the Viking Age actually is. Not a sudden eruption of inexplicable violence from the northern darkness, but the visible expression, at last fully visible to the outside world, of what a remarkable civilization had been building toward since the very beginning. The Norse did not appear from nowhere. They came from the land that made them, and they carried that land, its cold, its beauty, its demands, its gods, its stories, wherever they sailed. And the world would never be quite the same for having encountered them. If this journey through the true origins of the Vikings has opened up the history in ways you did not expect, please share this video with someone who loves history. There are so many layers to this story still waiting to be explored. Subscribe if you have not already, because we are going deeper into the Norse world in the videos ahead, into the gods, the sagas, the great voyages, and the civilizations the Norse built at the edges of the world. The story of the Vikings is far from over. In many ways, it is only just beginning.